Well, David, here we are at the hub of MSU.
Yeah.
In front of the iconic Sparty, which is basically like a symbol of rivalries across all kinds of, universities.
It's a big deal.
And I have a rivalry with Sparty and really everybody because I root for Duke. That's not the mayonnaise, but I'm a Blue Devil pastor because I went to Duke for seminary. And I didn't really ever have anything against the Spartans. I just, in March, I got to root for my Blue Devils. Now, while I was at seminary, Sarah and I took a class together, and we kind of got into a rivalry in that class. It was an ethics class of all classes, and I thought, man, I got to work really hard to get an A in this class because otherwise I will always feel intellectually inferior to my wife.
Don't want that, do you?
No. And so I worked really hard, and when grades came out, I was really relieved to find that I got an A.
Can't beat an A, so you're good.
Can't beat an A. When Sarah came home, I said, so what'd you get in ethics? And she looked at me and she said, an A+.
Wow.
I was like, Duke University doesn't give
No.
Does MSU give A+? Sparty, do you give A+? So that rivalry has been solved. Sarah is by far the smartest one in our family. How about you? Do you have any rivalries?
I don't really consider myself a competitive person. I mean, I enjoy sports. I have an interesting sports story. I grew up a Detroit Lions fan and also a Chicago Cubs fan.
Okay.
Which both have a long history of being labeled as losers. And being a fan, I still enjoy them. So I've just gotten used to losing. So it's really hard to have a rivalry when you are consistently the loser.
That's a good way to just opt out of the rivalry. That fits your personality perfectly,
Totally.
Actually. So today we're starting a new series called Ancient Rivalries. It's a belief series. We're talking about what do we believe, where did our beliefs come from, and why you might want to believe certain things and not other things.
Matthew quotes Jesus quoting Deuteronomy. Jesus says this: you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. What's interesting about that, in quoting Deuteronomy, Jesus is actually adding on to it. He adds the all your mind part.
Wow.
So in this series, we're going to ask everybody to put their thinking caps on, because to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind is necessary for this series.
Yeah, we're going to make people think in this series.
For sure.
Actually, I think Jesus is making them think.
That he does. So
in this series, we're looking at ancient rivalries: good versus evil, grace versus works, earth versus heaven, purity versus impurity.
And we're going to look at some rivalry big questions. Did a good God create bad things? Is matter or the body inherently evil? And how is that souls are oriented toward evil? Yeah, those are the questions we're looking at today in this rivalry, good versus evil. And we know all about this rivalry because it's in our culture all over the place. You've got Luke versus Vader, the dark side or the light side. You've got Batman versus the Joker. You've got Dorothy versus the Wicked Witch of the West. These are all rivalries. I mean, we get this idea of like good versus evil in our popular culture. So here's a question I have for you. What's your favorite rivalry? Which rivalries do you follow? Let's talk about that. There's plenty of rivalries to go around, aren't there? There are. Lots of fun ones, some that maybe we could tamp it down a little bit on the rivalry there. So we're going to take a look at these rivalries through the lens of St. Augustine and his debates with his ancient rivals. And today's debate is, in one corner, St. Augustine, and in the other corner, Manichaeism. That's a horrible name. You've heard of Manichaeism, right? I mean, I'm sure everybody, they're like, oh yeah, that's a common term. I'm not even sure if everyone even knows who Augustine is. This sermon is based off a book, The Mestizo Augustine, by Justo Gonzalez. And he says, save Paul and the other New Testament writers, no other Christian writer or thinker has left such a profound footprint on the life and thought of the church as St. Augustine. So he's pretty important. Yeah, you got basically, according to Justo Gonzalez, you got Jesus, Paul, and Augustine. You didn't even get Peter in there. Oh!
So here's what we want to do today. First, we want to introduce you to Augustine, and then we want to introduce you to Manichaeism, because most people probably never heard of that word even until today. And then we want to explore this ancient rivalry and the questions and debates they had and how they still reverberate with questions and debates we have today. So that's where we're going. You ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
So first, who was St. Augustine? We probably, I mean, if you've been in the church at all, you've probably heard of at least his name, or you've heard of the cities that are named after him.
Yeah.
So the first thing that we want to introduce you to is Augustine and his biracial nature. Augustine was from North Africa, which means he's African, he's black. Except Western painters have almost always painted him as white. They've literally whitewashed Augustine's Africanness out of him. He's an African. So Augustine was trained in Rome, in Italy, in Roman rhetoric, which this makes him kind of biracial. He's got both his kind of Roman side and he's got his African side, just basically like any biracial group in America today. You've got Asian Americans, you've got Latin Americans, you've got African Americans, you've got English, Scottish, Wales Americans like myself. Do you have any biracial connection? I mean, your last name feels like
Lalone, that's French, but I also have some Dutch, some German, so I just consider myself a European mutt American. And I think many people listening can relate, having either European or Asian. America's pretty diverse, and with that diversity comes the necessity to actually have to lean back and forth between our different cultural, ethnic, and racial backgrounds, depending on the situation. And we see Augustine sometimes leaning on his African foot, and other times he leans on his Roman foot.
So there's actually a word for this in the Hispanic community. The word is mestizo, which I didn't even know that word until we started working on this series. And it comes from this book that we've been reading that we're basing this whole series on. You already referenced it. Justo Gonzalez wrote this book called The Mestizo Augustine, a theologian between two cultures. Now, Justo Gonzalez is also a mestizo. He's a Cuban-American Christian historian, and he's also a United Methodist pastor, so he's a colleague of mine.
Nice.
I don't actually know him, but I've read several of his books. Now, my family comes from England. We come from Scotland, Ireland, Wales. I mean, we're Arthurs, like King Arthur, Knights of the Round Table. But I don't usually feel very biracial as far as like racial and ethnicity. This is part of, I think, white supremacy and the way it plays out in our culture. But there are some places where I do feel really bicultural, and one of those is the transition between being in Sycamore Creek's culture and being in our larger denominations culture of United Methodism, because we do things so differently at Sycamore Creek.
True.
That I have to do all kinds of translation. So I often have to stand on my United Methodist foot at sometimes, and other times I have to stand more on my Sycamore Creek foot. How about you? Do you ever have to go back and forth between two cultures?
For anyone that has been married can relate with having your own family culture and having to get used to your in-laws' culture.
Yeah.
Anytime you talk about culture, you have to talk about food, right?
Uh-huh.
And so growing up, my family would often have a home-cooked meal, but in front of a TV, sitting on a couch.
That's like my family.
But my in-laws would have a home-cooked meal around a dining room table.
That's like Sarah's family. We were the
so you can relate.
And the heathens, and our in-laws are cultured.
As they would say. And I also, growing up, rarely ever went to restaurants.
Yeah.
Where my in-laws would frequently go to the restaurants, and so it was almost a cultural shock of even just learning how to order my own food.
Yeah, that's opposite. My family would go to restaurants, with Sarah's wouldn't.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, no, so we go back and forth between those two different cultures. So here's a question we have for you. Where do you find yourself going back and forth between two cultures, whether that's a racial culture or an ethnic culture or just a subculture? Let's talk about that. So I do think that we all have had some experience of shifting between two cultures, whether it's our families, cultures, or biracial or bi-ethnic culture of some sort. That was Augustine's life.
Yep.
And let's give people a little biography of Augustine, a little more. He was born in 354 AD in Tagaste, which is modern day Algeria near Tunisia, Libya, and Morocco. These are all northern African areas. And this area in its day was ruled by Romans, so it was an occupied territory. The Romans had a Greco-Roman culture, which valued Stoicism, kind of like a intellectualism. And Augustine's northern Africans were called Berbers, not Berber carpet, but Algerians. And they valued spontaneity, emotional passion, and so on. So the Romans viewed the Berbers as barbarians. But interestingly enough, I didn't know this until we started studying this, is that Latin theology came out of North Africa.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Which that's, of course, theology written in Latin, this dead language.
Yeah, so let's take a look at his family.
Yeah.
He knows a little something about being trapped between two different family cultures as well. If you look at his dad whose name was Patrick.
Yeah, like St. Patrick.
No, not that Patrick.
Okay.
We don't know a whole lot about him, but we do know, and there's like no pictures of him or anything, but we know that he was a Roman, so he was taking on a little more of that Stoic rationalism.
Yeah.
And he wasn't a Christian, but later on converted to Christianity near his death.
Yeah. So the person that we do know a lot about is Augustine's mom, Monica, which artists, just like they've done with Augustine, they've done this with Monica. They whitewashed her, made her white, but she was African. She's Algerian, Berber. Whereas Patrick wasn't a Christian, Augustine's mom, Monica, was a very devout Christian. Or depending on which way you look at it, she was like a super mom or a super clingy mom who followed Augustine all the way to Italy to make sure that he converted and actually got baptized. So Augustine is Roman through his dad, rational, intellectual Stoicism. He is African through his mom, passion, energy, creativity, spontaneity. He's a mestizo, a biracial person. And there's this rivalry then that goes on here between Africa and Europe, Africa and Rome, Italy.
Yeah, and as he looked at his mom's Berber Christianity, he looked at it as being too emotional.
Mm-hmm.
So earlier on in his life, he leaned much more towards his dad's Roman Stoicism, rationalism,
intellectualism.
The intellectualism, yeah.
Although eventually that didn't work for him anymore. He ended up finding it unsatisfactory.
I've never been satisfied.
Augustine tells the story of his conversion in what is thought to be the first autobiography in the Western world. It's called The Confessions of St. Augustine, which, interestingly enough, I read this book for the first time in a public school in an English literature class.
Really?
Because it's literally the first autobiography in the Western world, or thought to be. And in it, he tells this iconic story of stealing pears with his friends, not because they are hungry, but for the sheer thrill of stealing. Now, I wonder if people out there have had an experience like that themselves. Have you ever done something for the sheer thrill of doing something wrong? Let's talk about that.
So I think we've all can share that experience with Augustine, of that feeling of wanting to do something just because it's the wrong thing, that thrill. And that character of Augustine, it begins to start to change.
Mm-hmm.
He has a garden experience. So instead of stealing he's in the garden and he hears a voice. And the voice says, "Take and read, take and read."
Augustine interprets this as take and read the Bible.
Yes.
So he pulls out his Bible app and scrolls to the first book.
Not exactly, but yes, he finds a passage in Romans. And I'm going to read that for you. Don't participate in the darkness of wild parties and drunkenness, or in sexual promiscuity and immoral living, which Augustine at this point is already knows.
He's doing all these things.
He knows a bit about that. Or in quarreling and jealousy. Instead, clothe yourself with the presence of the Lord Jesus Christ. And don't let yourself think about ways to indulge your evil desires. So this passage and this experience in the garden pulls him towards God. And later on, he gets baptized by St. Ambrose of Italy.
In Milan.
Yeah.
So there's this African in Italy converting to Christianity, getting that Roman side of his bicultural, his mestizo-ness. So in this moment, he finds a kind of satisfaction that he had not had. And he opens this autobiography of the Confessions with probably the most iconic line of everything that he's written. And he says, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in you."
Wow.
Our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. Satisfaction.
Yeah. So we definitely see his life being transformed. And he later on, he develops builds a community of other believers. What we might actually call like a commune. He lives and does life together of faith with his fellow believers, brothers and sisters, and he's influenced by them. And it's here that he goes on to write many of the books that he writes.
Eventually, he moves back to North Africa, and he basically creates the same thing there with many of the same people. But his intellectual talent does not go unnoticed. He's eventually ordained a priest and then the Bishop of Hippo. As the Bishop of Hippo, he attends to the needs of his parish. He does a lot more writing of books, and he has lots of arguments with his ancient rivals.
Yes.
All right, that's Augustine.
Yeah.
Let's now turn to today's rivalry, which everybody's really here for that, right? The rivalry.
Yeah, I mean, that's the action, right?
Augustine in one corner versus Manichaeism.
That's such an awful name.
I don't really pull that off very well, do I? I need like a microphone that comes down out of the sky.
Michael Buffer, you gotta channel your Michael Buffer.
Weighing in at 250 pounds in the corner, the Bishop from Hippo.
For the thousands in attendance.
So Manichaeism, I mean,
Yeah.
You've heard of that, right? Like
Totally,
there's
yeah.
The First Church of Manny.
Hasn't everybody?
Isn't in here in East Lansing? I mean, there's all kinds of churches in East Lansing.
Yeah, on every corner.
Well, no, there is no First Church of Manny because which is crazy because Manichaeism was like the primary rival to Christianity in Augustine's day, but in large part due to his entire like intellectual rebuttal of it.
He just destroyed them.
It doesn't exist anymore. Now that's not what happens with all of the rivalries.
Okay.
But with this one, Augustine entirely wins, and Manichaeism dies out, and that's why there's no First Church of Manny in Lansing or anywhere. In its wake, though, this debate that Augustine had with Manichaeism has left all kinds of sort of questions and a sort of theological wake ever since for the last 1700 years.
Pretty big question. Like, where does evil come from? I don't even know how to answer that right now. Well, we're looking at Manichaeism first before we get into the smashdown that Augustine. I don't.
Smackdown.
Or the smackdown. That might be better.
You're gonna have to work on your rivalry language.
I guess so.
Smashdown's not bad though. That sounds like a word I would make up.
Yeah, on the spot. Yeah. Oh. So Manichaeism is actually named after a 3rd century Persian. So he lived like 100 years or so before Augustine.
Modern day Iranian.
Yeah. And he considered himself the Paraclete, which is the Greek for the Comforter. So you might remember Jesus telling his disciples that the Comforter, the Paraclete, would come after him, which we know as Christians as the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. But Manny wanted to don that title himself as the Paraclete. And he's also very influenced by the other religions that came before him, and he sort of just took from those religions and built his own. Starting with Zoroastrianism, which, again, people probably don't know what Zoroastrianism, but just think about the Magi in the Christmas story, the ones that came and saw the star and brought those gifts to baby Jesus. Then he also took a little bit from Buddhism and Christianity, and he created his religion of Manichaeism.
Now, Manichaeism had a kind of rationalism that appealed especially to the rational Stoic Romans, and it explained things in a kind of scientific way. Now, we look back now and think it was kind of hokey, but in its day, it was considered to appeal to the stars and the moon, and that had a kind of rational scientific feel to it.
So it also taught Manichaeism also taught a radical dualism. So it didn't believe in one all-powerful being as God, but rather two competing forces. And some of these forces might be like light and darkness, good versus evil.
We're back into Star Wars.
Star Wars, yeah, Luke versus Vader. So this radical dualism also brought an idea, a salvation idea of freeing the soul from the body as if it was trapped. Because in our life, these two forces that should be separate are often intermingling. That's how Manichaeism explains the origin of evil. And this idea of freeing the soul, it might sound very familiar to many Christians. We hear this around funerals and any conversation on death, is understanding that our immortalness is our soul and it breaks free from our mortal bodies. I often think of like the hymn "I'll Fly Away,"
I'll fly away.
which is not
This is not Christianity. I feel like we should look at that camera and say, "This is not Christianity.
This is not
This is not
Christianity."
Even though lots of Christians think that's what Christianity is.
And because of this radical dualism, Manichaeism also taught the belief that Jesus was just spirit and not body.
Yeah.
Because again, those two things can't come together. That would be bad. So a holy God cannot take on flesh.
So there were these big questions then in this rivalry, which we've already alluded to. Did a good God create bad things? Is matter or the body inherently evil? And how is it that the soul is oriented toward evil? So we've been talking about Manny, but let's get back to Augustine here, because he's the one who eventually wins the day, wins the rivalry.
Of course.
And what did he believe in this ancient rivalry? And he goes back to Genesis and he says, listen, God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And so matter, the body, is not evil. It's good, according to Augustine reading the Bible. So what is evil?
Augustine argued that evil is actually nothing.
Nothing.
That there is no substance or being that is evil in of itself. Evil is rather a disordering of good things.
So I think back to St. Paul talking to Titus, writing a letter to him, and he says, to the pure all things are pure, but to the corrupt and unbelieving nothing is pure. Their very minds and consciences are corrupted. So you see the disordering of good things. Think about sex, for example. I mean, sex is good. Thank you, God, that sex is good. But bad sex is disordered sex, like, for example, rape, or Christians believe that sex is at its best in a lifelong commitment.
Yeah, or we think about food. Food is good, but when food becomes bad when it is eaten in excess, like gluttony.
So here's a question for us. Where have you seen good or neutral things used in bad ways? Let's talk about that.
So let's get back to Christianity. Christianity affirms the unity of the body and the soul as good. We see this in the incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, God himself, becomes flesh into the body of Jesus. And we also see this in the resurrection of Jesus. And after the resurrection of Jesus, where he eats fish.
It's always a funny little detail. Why does he eat fish?
I think to show that, because if you saw someone come back from the dead, what would you think? You would think ghost, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't think that he still had flesh. You think about Thomas touching his wounds. And when we recite the Apostles' Creed, we profess, I believe in the resurrection of the body.
The body being
good.
So then the question comes, where does evil come from? And for Augustine, evil is a disordering of good things. We can develop habits or ruts that are either good, virtue, or bad, vice. Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends, writes a letter that is in our New Testament, and he says this: by his divine power, God has given us everything we need for living a godly life. We received all of this by coming to know him, the one who called us to himself by means of his marvelous glory and excellence. And because of his glory and excellence, he has given us great and precious promises. These are the promises that enable you to share his divine nature, that is his goodness, and escape the world's corruption caused by human desires. I think Augustine would read that as human disordered desires. But we in the world go through growing pains. I'm not talking about an 80s sitcom. I'm talking about like when your kids wake up in the middle of the night and their legs hurt because they're growing. The world is going through growing pains that sometimes we call acts of God. You think about tectonic plates, and of course earthquakes are created by tectonic plates, and we'd call those sometimes an act of God. But Augustine says those aren't evil, those are growing pains. In fact, we now know that if we didn't have tectonic plates, life couldn't exist.
Those growing pains, that's part of being human, of growing physically, spiritually, and all those things. And God gives us this marvelous thing of free will, which gives the potential for us to take this free will, this ability to make bad decisions, or those habits and ruts, those vices.
To freely take good things and use them poorly,
Yeah.
badly.
So is God the author and creator of evil and therefore responsible for it?
Yeah, Augustine's going to go back again to Genesis. God saw everything that he made, and indeed it was very good. And then he's going to quote the prophet Isaiah, which he loved to quote against the Manichaeists. He'd say, "Woe to them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." God created things and called them good.
Remember, Augustine said that evil is nothing.
It's so hard to wrap our mind around the idea that evil is nothing, but God created, and what God created was good, and evil then is just a distortion of that. It's not anything by itself without being a distortion first of something good.
I don't know if I fully understand it, but it works. I think it resonates, I guess I would say.
So we're left with these rival big questions. Did a good God create bad things?
No.
Augustine and Sparty say, no, God created and called it good. Is matter of the body inherently evil? Well, Augustine says, no.
No.
God created us with a unity between body and soul and called it very good. And the last question, how is it that the soul is oriented towards evil? And Augustine says, our free will disordered good things. It disordered love.
So Augustine, the African bishop, trained in Roman and Latin rhetoric, develops a rational defense of Christianity that eventually contributes to the total discreditation of Manichaeism. And it died out completely, which is why there is no First Church of Manny down the street.
Are you sure there's not one over on Abbott Road here in East Lansing?
No.
I thought that...
You might want to get your eyes checked.
So at the end of the first period, Augustine won.
1.
Rivals
0.
0. I'm sure we answered everybody's questions, or Augustine answered everybody's questions about good and evil. You think so?
It's a starter.
Probably not. So we're curious, what questions do you have left about good and evil? Let's talk about that.